Graze on over. My name is Haley Goodwiler, joining you today on behalf of the National Grazing Lands Coalition. Today, our presenting sponsor is Ranchworthy. Whether you're a producer, student, policymaker, or curious viewer, you'll find honest insights, practical knowledge, and Ranchworthy perspectives that matter. Follow Ranchworthy on YouTube today. We're thrilled you're here for our conversation on responsive agriculture. Today, we're honored to be joined by three exceptional leaders in this space. Dr. Bill Fox, my co-host this evening, Dr. Tryon Wickersham, Presidential Professor for Teaching Excellence and Associate Head for Research in the Development of Animal Science and Texas A&M University, and Dr. Marco Palma, Interim Associate Director for Responsive Agriculture at Texas A&M's Institute for Advancing Health Through Agriculture. Thank you all for joining us. Your work is helping us bridge critical conversations across agriculture, health, and consumer behavior. Before we get started, a few quick notes. We are recording today's session. The recording will be sent out to all who registered. Please use the chat now that it's working to share any questions and comments throughout, and we will have a dedicated Q&A time at the end of Dr. Wickersham and Dr. Palma's presentation. If you have any audio or video issues, try leaving and rejoining or check your device settings under the Teams menu. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Fox to help frame today's conversation. Bill, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Haley. It is great to be here with the group today. Really looking forward to this conversation. Haley and I, about 6 or 8 months ago, started discussing, what things might look like for a webinar towards the end of the year. And we got on the topic of, what's going on when it comes to consumers and things like that. So today's conversation is going to be a little bit different. A lot of times in our efforts here, we're talking about grazing management or animal health, or we've talked about mental health in the industry. But today we're going to take a little bit different look at it. We got two wonderful folks. One of, I've got to say, Dr. Wickersham's having a little bit of a technical difficulty. So he may be joining us just a little bit late, but irregardless, we're going to get through this because I think Dr. Palma and I could probably carry on a conversation for quite a while on this topic. And anyway, we're going to take a little bit different look at things from a different perspective. The work that Dr. Palma has done in the past and it continues to do with the Institute really focuses on the consumer and kind of the decision-making process and things like that. And that's something that we don't always think about on the front side or up the supply chain from what's going on. So he really has his finger on the pulse of what drives people to make the decisions that they have based upon their nutritional needs, based upon the desires that they have for their family and things like that. So it's a little bit different look today. And the way we've got this set up, like I said, Dr. Wickersham's having a little bit of an issue, but we're going to go ahead and skip over. Dr. Palma has kind of some slides to set the stage of how he and the group that he works with develops an understanding of what's going on in the consumer mind and how they measure this. And then we're just going to go into a deep dive on kind of what's driving this and want to try to get folks to understand that or get a better handle on, that downstream in the supply chain of what, that we are providing as producers. How is it being received as consumers? And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Palma and let him introduce himself and some of the work that he has been doing. And we'll just go from there. And if we get Dr. Wickersham squared away, we'll get him in here and moving forward with us. So Dr. Palma, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Fox, Haley. It is really wonderful to be here and to spend some time talking about something that is very dear to me and very interesting. So I've devoted my career and my life to try to understand the why. Why drives our decisions? Why do we do the things that we do? And so in doing so, I direct the Human Behavior Lab here at Texas A&M, and we use the neuroeconomics approach. So what does that mean exactly? Well, let me tell you what neuroeconomics is all about. So we combine at least three different disciplines, perhaps more, but at the core of neuroeconomics, we're interested in really overlapping economics. And with these, what we want to understand is, can we predict what people do? Because if we're able to create models that allow us to understand and predict what people are doing, that's what economics is all about. And how do people respond to unlimited wants in the face of having limited resources? And that's really at the core of what economics is about. On the other hand, just predicting what people are going to do and observing the final choice is important, but perhaps it's equally important to understand the reasons behind that behavior and the motivations that drive people to do that, the action, the final action. Sometimes we might do something and we're not entirely sure what we did, but at the end of the day, we try to understand both the conscience, the conscious procedures that make us do something, and sometimes also we allow, and I'm going to get into these in a minute here, we allow the body to tell the story as to why we made the decision that we did. And the third component is understanding what happens in our brain when we're making those decisions, because perhaps we might be able to understand a little better why certain type of treatments, why certain type of stimuli might work with somebody, but it might not necessarily produce the desirable outcomes with other people. And so that is at the core of neuroeconomics. One thing that I really want to emphasize here is that there is usually a gap between what people say they're going to do and what they actually do with real stakes when there is real money on the line and in real markets. And so there is usually this idea that if we ask consumers what do they want to do, how much are they willing to pay for a particular product, how big of a portion they're going to eat for dinner, how much food they're going to buy when they go to the grocery stores. All of these things are completely fine. But really, at the core of the decision-making process, and if we really want to work on topics and issues and valuations that are a closer representation of the consumer, we need to work in settings where people are providing their decisions with real incentives and where their actions are really mapping into markets so that we get a closer representation of real behavior. And so most of our experiments, if not all of our experiments, have incentives, which means that people are really paying real money and they're getting products for real. Sometimes those products are given to them in person when they come to the lab, but sometimes those products are shipped all across the country to make sure that we have a good representation of consumer behavior and also that is widely representative of the U.S. population, so that we get a pretty good feeling of what's happening at the national level. So why do we want to study the brain? Let me give you a little bit of a very rough and core rundown as to why should we care about what happens in the brain. There are three main systems or areas of the brain that are important for a decision-making process. When you look at the brainstem, that regulates most of our automatic processes. And so that regulates our respiration rates, our heart rates, our blood pressure. It regulates the size of our pupils so we can adjust to changes in the lighting conditions. And all of these things happen automatically. We do not have to worry, thankfully, about having to manually moderate some of these changes. And this is very important in the neuroeconomics tools because these are things that we're not able to change at will. Unless you have been trained by the CIA, not very many of us are able to change the size of our pupils, for example, that we want to portray. We might be able to change the facial expressions and the way we smile when somebody makes a bad joke, and I'm notoriously guilty of making bad jokes sometimes. But we're not really able to modulate this. And so it becomes important because these involuntary movements and physiological responses help us to really understand why we're doing what we're doing. And that's at the core of what we do. The limbic system is the system related to emotions and decisions. So anything that produces a reward activates that system. And then the prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive decision making. And so you might think about the economics toolbox as an interaction between different areas of the brain that are in content and constant trade-offs, deciding whether the benefits and the cost of making taking an action. And then those reactions that originated in the brain will produce a physiological response in the body. And so in our lab, what we're trying to do is trying to capture the physiological response through multiple devices and multiple equipment that will, for example, allow us to look directly in the brain and also look at our visual attention. What is it that is capturing our attention? How are our pupils dilating? Because the pupils dilate in response to changes in light, but they also dilate as a response to emotional arousal when we have a big sensation, whether it's positive or negative. So if they tell you, hey, you just won a lottery, you get a pretty large reaction. But if they tell you something bad happened, then you also get this pretty large response. You have the facial expressions, and you have these other automatic responses, such as stress signals that you capture through changes in the amount of sweat in the fingers. And all of this representation of responses in the body allow us to truly understand not just the outcome, but the entire decision-making process and the emotional attachment that we have in some of those decisions. Now, let me try to put this together through an example, because this is getting to the point that, okay, all of that is pretty interesting and good, but why should you care about all of these tools that we're using to try to understand behavior from economic experiments? So in this example, I always like to talk about these because this was conducted at a time when McDonald's decided to ban trans fats from their French fries. And McDonald's has been around for a long time, so they didn't just go and turn off the switch and completely eliminated trans fats from every single restaurant. They actually did it in such a way that some restaurants implemented the change while others kept doing business as usual. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to see what was the possible impact on sales and customer satisfaction, and measure all of these possible things in changing the formulation of the French fries. Now, what happened was fascinating, because everybody started complaining that the French fries did not taste good anymore, even in the restaurants that had not made the switch yet. Imagine that. So how powerful it is that the perception of a change in the formulation that is linked to a flavor profile was enough for people to perceive that the fries did not taste good anymore. Now, many of us might think, oh, maybe this is a failure in a way of thinking, it's a failure in our perception. Is it really a failure in perception? When does perception become a reality? Well, let me tell you one of my favorite experiments that was conducted by Helke Plasman and her colleagues. What she did is that she brought a group of people who were really well versed in wine. They were wine connoisseurs. These are people who claim to really know a lot about their wine. And they came into the lab and they tasted two different bottles of wine. One was priced at $90 and the other one was priced at $10. Here's the catch. The two bottles of wine were identical. The labels were identical. Everything was exactly the same. The only difference was the price tag on top of the bottle to showcase the price. Here I'm picturing one of the labels in green and another one in blue, so you can see what happened. But in reality, everything was the same. And if you ask me, which one do I think people like the most? Well, if you're thinking the most expensive one, you're absolutely right. But the experiment did not end up there. What happened was that they actually look at through an fMRI machine, which is a device that captures activity in the brain. They look at the activity in the brain when people tasted the $90 bottle of wine and the $10 bottle of wine. And what they found was fascinating. So the medial, what you see in those graphs over there is the activation in the medial orbitofrontal cortex. That's the region of our brains that is right behind our eyes, in the middle of the brain. And that region of the brain is important because that's the part of the brain that produces pleasure when we consume things through our taste, when we taste something or when we smell something that is pleasant. Now, wait a minute. These are the bottles are exactly the same, right? They're identical, but yet we see this higher reward for the bottle that is more expensive. So this study is important for several reasons. The first one, because it shows that we humans are microbiologically wired to derive pleasure from consuming things we think are expensive or prestigious. This is the basis of marketing, and that's quite important. But the second most important thing that you should all if you do not remember anything about this webinar, this is the one thing that you want to remember, is that here the non-physical properties of a product affect how much pleasure the physical properties produce. In other words, things that are not related to the taste affect how much we enjoy a food product. And this is important because it's at the core of everything that we have to do in terms of providing labeling that differentiates the products. In this case, it might be that meats that are produced in different ways that differentiate that product. Now, it becomes very relevant from a neuroeconomics perspective because anything that you provide the consumer with information about the taste of the product will activate the reward area of the brain. And so it will make it more likely that people will want to buy that product. Now, if you portray something that relates to health, nutrition, that tends to activate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the region of the brain that is responsible for self-control. And so you're appealing to two different regions of the brain with potentially different messages. And so it's important for us because while we want to portray information that is useful for the consumer to make informed decisions related to health and nutrition, at the end of the day, taste is still a commanding factor as to why people make the decision of what to buy, when to buy it, how much of it to buy. And obviously, this study showcases that that has implications for how much pleasure they experience when they consume the product. And that is important because those are consumers who will come back to repurchase the product if they had a pretty good experience with it. And so that's the main dimension that we wanted to show here with this neuroeconomics approach. Now, when we bring people to the lab, we usually have a limited sample of consumers who are representative of the local consumers here in the Bryan College Station area, which is where our lab is located. And you can see that represented there. So that measure of value of how much people might be willing to pay for beefsteaks might be limited for that geographical location. And so we have implemented a methodology where we actually have incentives for people to provide their true valuation, how much they're willing to pay for, in this case, were beefsteaks. And what we did is that we did this online experiment, but we did lottery incentives. What does that mean? It means that we asked people to tell us how much are you willing to pay for these products, and there was a 10% chance that they would be selected to realize their decisions. And if their decisions were realized, then they had to pay for those steaks. And we went ahead and we shipped hundreds and hundreds of steaks using dry ice and coolers to all the consumers. And so what does that matter? Let me show you why it matters. Here are a couple of pictures of the steaks being prepared and packaged. This is how we ship all of those products all across the country. Why does this matter? These are the valuations that people gave us on average for the steaks. I think these were the sustainably produced steaks. When you ask people simply, how much are you willing to pay? They give you a much higher valuation for something that is positive. So anything that you portray as socially desirable, people will tend to inflate those valuations and say, of course I will eat organic, of course I will pay more for it. But what this shows is that when there is real money on the line, showing here with the 100% incentives, that means that everybody who was in that treatment had to pay for those steaks, and everybody received steaks. And we compare those with the lottery incentives, which essentially produce about the same valuations on average. But you can see that all of those valuations are lower than the estimates when you just ask people and there was no money on the line. So this is important because if you're thinking and considering how much will I get back from the consumers if I were to adopt certain practices that will allow me to differentiate my products? And if you're estimating the cost of implementing those practices and you want to find out how much money you're going to get in return, we want to get a clear understanding of how much the consumer values that. So with this, I wanted to give you sort of like a snapshot representation of some of the work that we're doing to get closer to the true valuations of the consumer. So this will be the outcome variable. And then the choice process data and the equipment allow us to truly understand how difficult the problem is, what are the areas that might be fixing on the package that might raise more interest. And not everybody looks at the same features. It turns out that some people might be interested in certain things like the location of production, the origin of the product, maybe looking at the marbling that is available. And so it's heterogeneous. And so when you think about how do you target your product to the market, it's not that you have one ideal product, one type of consumer. You actually have different segments of consumers, or people who are looking for different things. And then the question becomes, what are the things that these different kinds or the different types of segments are looking for, and how can I provide that value and that product to them? So the easiest way that I can think about these is if you think about how much heat should a hot sauce have? Imagine that you have and you live in a world where you have customers that either like it very mild or extremely hot. And then some of them maybe like it in the middle. So if you go by the law of average and try to satisfy one consumer, you might be tempted to use something that's satisfied somewhere in the middle and go by the average. And you will be rightly satisfying that segment that is in the middle, but you will be missing the mark with those who really want a product that is extremely hot and those who like it mild. So this is an example. In the first case, you need to find out how many bins of consumers do you have and how do you cater to those different types. So let's not think about one single consumer, one ideal product to provide, but think about understanding how many bins do I have and how do I cater to those consumers. So with that, I'm going to send the mic back here to Dr. Fox. And thanks again for the invitation. Hopefully this gave you a little summary of my research agenda and how that relates to some of the consumer decision making, with the idea that if we start with the consumer and understand what appeals to the consumer, then we might be able to trace that back all the way and provide the products and services that are more likely to be successful and to have higher acceptance and higher willingness to pay with the consumer.
Well, thanks, Dr. Palma. I really appreciate that. And it's so many different things have opened up with your conversation here. We had a couple of conversations earlier on, and I want to get to that. But there was one thing that just jumped out at me in your conversation there, and it's interesting. Haley, if you go back 2 slides, I think it was, and I want everyone to look at the color of that meat. Now, does that look like the color of the meat that you go into Kroger and buy? I mean, it's not the ones that I see usually. I will say this, and I'm not promoting anybody in particular, but if you look at Nolan Ryan branded steaks, they are that color, but most of them are that very bright pink color. And here we are, our eye has been trained to see that this bright pink color of our beef is what we want. And yet when you look at it, how it's actually produced and just naturally, and it's and its packaging there, that's the normal color of a steak coming off a cow. So it's interesting the way that you say that, and the way that, we could get into this a little bit later, the way that marketing and things like that are used in the consumer process of getting people to accept different types of things like that. But anyway, so Dr. Palma, thank you very much. It's interesting. I actually had the chance, and I'm going to tell a story on myself, and then I'm going to let Dr. Palma go into a little bit more, because it's interesting to get into the idea of what is the brain doing, and I know we're talking about neuroscience and economics here at a Grazing Forum, but this drives so much of how the product that we develop is being used and marketed. But back to the process. This is where I found really fascinating, and I'll let Dr. Palma tell a little bit more of the story of what it means afterwards. But I actually had the chance to go and spend a couple of hours at the Human Behavior Lab a few years ago, and they have this wonderful test that they give you, and it's dealing with the biometrics and things like that. So they're able to use where are you looking on the computer screen. They could develop heat maps from that. If you do the full headgear, they could develop all kinds of other things with it. But this was just one that was using my eyes. And they have these exercises that you go through. And this one in particular was just absolutely hilarious after the fact for me. Let me set the stage. I'm sitting there watching this, and the instructions say, count the number of times that people wearing a green shirt jump the jump rope. And so you've got people on there on the screen in red and blue and yellow and green, and I'm focused in on the green ones. And, I go through the whole process, and I count the number of times they jumped, and then I hit my answer, and then I go on to the next one. So after this is all over, Dr. Palma comes back in, and we're going through each of these scenarios. And he said, we get to this one, and he said, yeah, you got the number right. Did you see the chicken that was on the stage? And I looked at him and I said, there was no chicken on that stage when those kids were jumping rope. And he played the video back for me. And I'll be darned if somebody in a chicken suit didn't come walking out on the stage, but my eyes were so focused on those kids in green that I totally missed the big picture. And that's what we were talking about earlier. And Dr. Palma, I think maybe, what is that? What's going on when, you're so hyper focused in on one aspect of say operations that are going on and producing, meat-based proteins and things like that. You're focused in on one thing. What's going on with the rest of the world around you then? How do we explain and understand that?
That's an excellent question. And we have run a few experiments. We have a stress test. How much can human beings multitask? And at the core of this is this idea of, if you think about an analogy to computers, computers have two different types of processes. One is a serial process in which you have to perform something, one activity at a time, before you devote more processing power to do the next. The other way of doing this in the modern world now, with computing power that we have today, is to work in parallel. When you have multiple cores or multiple microprocessors working at the same time in different processes. Now, it turns out that we humans work pretty much in serial. We're not really able to work in multitasking. Now, picture yourself driving down the road, listening to the music that you truly enjoy. Your favorite song comes on in the radio. You turn the volume up, you're pumping, you're enjoying that, you're driving, and you're just enjoying a fantastic time. Now, all of a sudden, it starts raining. And what do? You go, oh my God, turn down the volume because I cannot see. Now, it's not that you cannot see, but this is a perfect example in, like, the music has nothing to do with your vision. It has nothing to do with that. But we have a finite amount of mental resources in our brains that we can use. And once those resources are used on a focal topic, that leaves less resources available for something else. Now, we're multitasking, doing something that's relatively mild and easy, no problem. But then the problem becomes when you're doing something that requires a significant amount of effort. And if that becomes a central point, then we have less available mental resources to make decisions in other domains. And this is important because when you're worried about, like me, for example, worried about, oh, I have a deadline for this project and I have to do these other things, then you're not really paying attention to a lot of decisions in the periphery. And so we are guilty of this as experts in our fields. We're all guilty of this. And so we use a significant amount of resources to making sure that we produce the best possible product. But then that means that we might be leaving less resources available to make decisions in other domains that are not as comfortable to us. Perhaps marketing decisions, adoption of new technology, using other things that might be good in the production process that we're not really familiar with. Crucially, we might be paying less attention to how much coffee we're drinking on a day, whether we're spending a couple of extra dollars here and there. And that might not matter in one day, but when we do this over the course of 20 or 30 years, then that tends to have a big impact in our lives. The other crucial aspect of this is that when we're devoting all of those resources in something that we're experts, and you know how to produce, you know how meat is supposed to look like, and you think that everybody else uses the same knowledge that you have to understand the same process. And so that is something that is called an expert bias, where we think that the consumer will know as much as we do, but the consumer doesn't necessarily know the same thing. So we ran an experiment once with different types of color of meat cuts and different marbling in the meat. And we asked animal science students versus students outside of the College of Ag to come and just look at those steaks. And it was fascinating to see how people who are familiar with the industry and the products, they tend to fixate on things that are completely different. The consumers might tend to look a little bit more about the cues for the USDA choice and prime, even if they don't know what that means. They look at the price, they look at the price per pound, they look at all these other features, while the animal science students were looking more at the marbling, the intramarbling features of the meat and other things that were more physical properties of it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that people are not necessarily looking at our products through the same lens that we do because we are experts and we have this high knowledge. And understanding that discrepancy sometimes is very costly. Let me tell you a story about an experiment that we did with the floral industry. This is a pretty fascinating study. We were looking at floral arrangements, and it turns out that we were trying to look at ways in which we can increase the profit margin or help florists make a little bit more profits. And there were many of these arrangements had a focal flower in the middle, a big flower. And in conversations with them, they told me, look, this flower is very expensive. It's fresh. It's imported. So it's like it comes from a pretty long way. It tends to be about $15. And so that brings the average of the floral arrangement, the price of it, the price tag high because of that central flower. And I asked, wait, is it possible to source a local flower of the same color and similar shape, but that would be a lot less expensive? And they said, no, the consumer will realize that that's a cheap option and they will not want the product, right? And so we put that to the test. And so we took advantage of these big conferences that were happening in town with florists. And so we ran this experiment where we changed that focal flower and we ran it with regular consumers and we ran it with florists. And so when we asked how much are you willing to pay, again, this is with incentives. So this is real money on the line. And we asked how beautiful is the arrangement. When we asked the expert, they saw a big gap, big difference in those two arrangements. Obviously, the one with the most expensive flower was more beautiful and they were willing to pay a significantly higher amount of money. What do you think happened when we asked the consumers? The consumers were not able to tell the difference. They looked at the two arrangements and they thought they're equally beautiful. You know, they were willing to pay exactly the same amount of money. And so the point of all of these is that we sometimes need to step away from what we do and try to think about what is different about the consumers. They do not necessarily know what I do. And being able to do that and to kind of avoid having the narrow focus of attention in one single item will allow us to try to understand and put ourselves in the shoes of non-experts to try to design the messaging that is more appropriate to try to connect with them.
That's fascinating. And I want to take a step back. So in your earlier discussion about, how that the multitasking ideas, if you want to put that in the grazing world, think about what's going on, that to your point of, you're implementing practices, you're doing all of these things. And if you look at, there was some work that was done that said, how many different expertise do you have to have in the grazing world? And it was a relative idea, but there were 48 different areas of expertise: economics, animal husbandry, soils, all of these things go into this bigger picture of trying to take these photosynthetic beans and run them through an animal that can turn it into a wonderful product that we as consumers like to take. And so your point about the multitasking, when it's simple things, we think that we're doing that. But when you start putting together, what I've got to do today to make sure that my animals are healthy, what do I need to do to make sure that my land is healthy for the next 5 years? What do I need to do to make sure that I'm able to send my kids to college 20 years from now? And you put all of that together into a decision-making process, I could see where it's always a real challenge, to try to put all of these things together. So it's, we can take a lot of these ideas and put them into the context of what we're doing as meat producers, whether you're beef cattle, lamb, goats, whatever it is, and look at that and say, oh, wow. And I tell another story. I want to tell another quick story that I learned again from my experiences in working with Dr. Palma and listening to this. I took a deep dive into the neuroscience as a range guy. That was kind of an interesting dive to take in the first place. But I spent a lot of time, trying to understand behaviors, because that's one thing in the grazing world that we do try to understand. What are those drivers behind decisions to implement this practice, to bring in this bull, to do all of these different things that we have to do? And I started thinking of all of the times that I have been out on a ranch talking to somebody. And I'd ask the question, well, why did you do that? Because I was curious, to understand the behavior. And a lot of times the answer was, well, I just had a feeling, I had an intuition, 40 years of looking at this made me think that I needed to do it this way. But you never could get a definitive answer of what it was, that was doing that. And I learned that behavior is that middle brain exercise, and it's not necessarily connected to a language. And so how do you translate that? And so that's kind of the interesting part about how this all fits together, is that, ultimately we're trying to produce a product in a sustainable way on a piece of ground, and have that product have the highest value that a consumer is going to want to engage with, so that we can meet all of these different goals, not only of our own family, but other things like that. So it's fascinating to do that. And again, my point is that as a range guy, I would have never dreamed of this until I had the opportunity to sit down with you and start talking about how this goes, and then seeing how it translates from the production of that animal all the way to the purchase of that product at the end. And it's just fascinating. So Dr. Palma, you opened my eyes a lot to a lot of different things, and made a lot of things in my, from my perspective on on working with range professionals and producers, how do you have that communication and that conversation in a way that true understanding is more developed, if that makes sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, these entire processes are really changing, and sometimes factors that we might not necessarily think about are affecting the way we perceive something and how we react to it. So, in hearing your story here, there are a couple of things that jump to me. The first one is related to difficult processing of things. So when you talk about all those factors that you need to do to be an effective producer, is very complex. And human beings are designed to try to go through the path of least resistance, which means when we encounter something complex or something that requires too much effort, we do not want to spend the energy required to do so, because that means, that we're going to use up that energy, and that's not necessarily completely optimal for the body. So we will use shortcuts to try to make those decisions. And that's important because we all do that. We do that as producers, but the consumer also engages in this type of behavior. And sometimes we have been trained since we're little kids that providing more information is better, having more products is better. But sometimes that causes information overload. When you're providing too much, you're flooding the consumer with so much information that at the end of the day, they get paralyzed and they're not necessarily using that information effectively. And so sometimes having one single message or a couple of ideas within the message that convey your story, that tell the consumer why, and that establishes a connection is a way to go. And so sometimes you can achieve more with less information that is easier to process, that requires less effort to search, less effort to process. And so anything that you can do to lower the complexity and the cost, the searching cost for finding that information will be very useful. And then, a good way to think about these ideas that you were talking about is this idea that Daniel Kahneman put together, who was a Nobel laureate, a Nobel laureate in economics. It was a psychology really challenge a lot of the big assumptions that we economists were making about rationality. But he thought about this idea of having two different systems, system one and system two, with one of them being a little bit more intuitive and something that is a little bit more impulsive. So that would be an emotional response. And one that is a little bit more deliberate and critical thinking that would analyze all the information and all the data. And these two systems live in constant interaction when we make a decision. And so when you arrive at a decision that is intuitive, my way of thinking about this is like sometimes that's not necessarily something that we have to separate here what's impulsive, something that I want to do because my entire feeling is saying you should go for the 16-ounce instead of the 8-ounce. That's a different kind of engagement and emotional attachment. And there's a big difference when you're using your entire experience as producer to use your instinct to make a decision. That's a completely different situation. And so it reminds me that there is a movie called I Can Only Imagine. And it turns out that this kid writes this award-winning song in 15 minutes. And everybody's fascinated that it took him 15 minutes to write this award-winning song. Well, the reality is that he had years and years of experiences. And it took him 15 minutes to sit down and actually write about those experiences. But it took a lifetime to experience everything that he went through to be able to sit down and write that in 50 minutes. And so what I'm saying here is that when you have an instinct that is coming out of your experience, your interaction with production and with all these other facets of decision making, it's an entire different situation than just being impulsive about a decision. And that's sort of like an important distinction there, because one is coming from your expertise and you're learning by doing, and you're learning by trials. and the other one is a little bit more impulsive. So if you can just separate those things that you feel are, oh, this is an impulse talking, like I should really buy this machine just for the sake of buying it, even though I haven't done any economic analysis to see if it's going to be, the cost benefit analysis is going to pay off. That's different than saying I don't think that this is going to work out in terms of increasing yield. And so separating those things, I think it's important, and that's what gives you a competitive advantage of the learning by doing process that you've developed over the years.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, and it touches on some of the conversations that we had early on of what we were trying to understand when it comes to producers and the successful folks that are out there doing this. And it's also one of the pieces of information that we don't have in our field very much, at least quantified, and that is that experiential learning that has taken place that has led to a lifetime of decision making. And it's funny that the way thinking of this recently, Haley and I just had a chance to visit in August a very successful rancher in Sterling County, and he is probably one of the most, I've learned more from him and from others like him, and other ladies like that have had this long experience because they've done it. Mm-hmm. And guess what? They failed at it, which is not a bad thing, in my opinion, because you learn very quickly. It didn't take, sometimes it took me 2 times of sticking my finger in a light socket, but most people 1 time, it doesn't take much to learn not to do things. So that failure is a good thing. And I say that because in our industry, there is a lot of failure because people, you're trying to work in, as you said earlier, a very complex system, and trying to make decisions that have to be made with less than perfect information and that have tremendous impacts, well beyond the gate and what's going on, and at the mercy of a lot of other factors outside. Well, we're winding down, Dr. Palma, and I wanted to do two quick things. I know we're going to put some questions at the end, but I wanted to ask real quick if you could give us a little bit better understanding about what responsive agriculture is and kind of what y'all are doing with trying to look at how agriculture fits in this bigger picture of health and where we're going as a food system in the country.
Absolutely. So we see responsive agriculture as trying to understand, we use a consumer-centric approach, which means that we start by looking at the consumer and understanding the consumer wants and needs, so we can design the entire food system to try to trace back what is it that we can do all the way throughout the supply chain to create products and services that will improve the profitability and the resilience of farmers and ranchers to ensure that they are able to grow products that will be profitable and that will have a higher likelihood to resonate and be accepted and valued by the consumer. And also, we want to be able to create these products that have a nutritional component and nutritional value so that the consumer can have healthier and healthier lifestyles. And so it's about trying to make the connection between agriculture and food and health and human health, while ensuring that the system is profitable throughout the supply chain, so that only when every actor in the chain benefits is when we have a system that is sustainable and that is profitable for everyone.
That's I used it earlier. That is kind of the holy grail, if we could pull all of these things together. And it's great to know that folks are working on it, not only at Texas A&M, but I know that you work with colleagues around the world, on these efforts, all with the idea that that starts with producers. I'm going to admit my bias there because it has to start at that point.
But at the core, at the core of that is really we want to make sure that we are connected to our producers and our stakeholders. And so we want to be able to establish strategic partnerships to work on topics that matter and that can create an impact. And it starts with the producer. We do not want to just work on research. We do some research that is basic, that is important for the advancement of science, but we also want to work on things that are empirically and that apply to the problems of today. For producers, how can we make more efficient use of resources that are limited? And so asking first some interesting questions related to that, and making sure that we are doing this in partnership with our stakeholders. And so we definitely are looking to create these strategic partnerships, and we invite producers and stakeholders to be part of the solution, to help us understand what are the questions that are worth pursuing, and to help us have a true partnership so we can pursue grants and projects that really have an impact in the bottom line production.
Oh, that's great. Well, Haley, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We got into quite a conversation here, and I hope we didn't corner the market on it, but there might be a question or two out there before we finish up.
Yeah, I just wanted to open the floor. If anyone has a question, they can drop it in the Q&A or in the chat. I did have a question for you, Dr. Palma. How might we bridge the gap between consumers and producers? If I'm a producer and I'm selling direct to consumer, how can I be smarter to connect with who I'm selling to? Is there like any key takeaways that producers who are selling direct to consumer can start to apply to their productions?
I think that the strategy of selling direct to consumers is very different than the typical commercial agriculture production that is based on a very careful cost accounting. I think when it comes to selling directly to the consumer, entails a couple of issues. The first one is to make sure that you're differentiating your products. What does that mean? What is the value that you are creating to the consumer? And the value can be created through the physical properties of the products. Now, when you look at people selling directly to the consumer, whether those are the final consumer, restaurants, or specialty markets, I've never seen anybody who says my product is okay. There are other products that are better. The products tend to be, by definition, higher quality. And that's sort of like an implied thing, minimum threshold that people expect to see when you're selling directly to the consumer. This is why the consumers will come looking for your products. But then how do you connect with them? How does it resonate with them? And what is it that the consumers in your area are looking for? People are looking to satisfy a desirable appeal for a pleasant experience. And that starts with the physical taste, but it also resonates with everything around it. So people being able to support the local economy, to support the community, to connect and do things for others that are important. We human beings are a lot more altruistic than economic model that conventional economic models would predict. And so anything that we can do to connect with the consumer and resonate that the products and services are really creating value beyond that individual, but that are really making a positive change, that's something that we should look into. And if we go back to the core message with that wine experiment, is that everything counts to how much people are going to enjoy your product. Because once you see the activation in the brain that started in the limbic system in a region called the nucleus accumbens, once we get the dopamine response, people indeed physically enjoy more of that product, even though there was exactly the same physical product. And so everything that you put in the label that connects with the consumer, make it simple so that they find it, that they connect with it, and that it creates value for the consumer that you're looking for.
That's a great idea there. And I think that's a growing market that's taking place. Well, Haley, we're running up against the hour here, and I know that we took a little bit different twist on things than we normally do with this, but really appreciate the opportunity. Dr. Palma, thank you so much for your time and willingness to share with us. Gives us something to think about. And yeah, we're talking about consumers, but a lot of those things that you talked about today goes into our everyday life of decision making. We're consumers, one, of the product, but two, also of the effort that we have in working in our industry, and we have to make those decisions. So it's not easy, and we really thank you sharing some insight with us today.
Hey, thank you for the invitation. This has been fun. I appreciate it, and I wish you the best. And hopefully, this will be the first of several other interactions with this group. Thank you so much again for the invitation, and have a good evening.
Thank you. And thank you, Haley. Thank you for Nat GLC for hosting us, and Ranch Worthy for helping us put this on tonight.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for sharing your valuable perspectives, Dr. Palma and Bill. Thank you so much. If you're interested in continuing this conversation, please stay connected with Nat GLC and Ranch Worthy on YouTube, or you can find us on social media channels, and keep an eye out for future events and resources at grazinglands.org. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and thank you for being a part of this movement towards responsive and resilient agriculture. You'll have a great one.
Goodbye.